This, my friends, is the project that got me hooked on 3D printing, opened the door to 3D CAD modeling, and fueled a passion for knitting machines. This is a homemade circular sock machine. Now, to be clear, I did not design this machine. I did design a different kind of knitting machine, which you can learn more about in some of my other videos. But I can't take credit for this one. This build is based on a design on Thingiverse, originally made by a user called Diffle, which was extensively remixed by Jeeping Johnny. I also incorporated some remixes and accessories by Jerry Baggett. This machine has a pretty special place in my heart, but it does have a few design quirks that make it challenging to follow sock tutorials made on other styles of machines. I've picked up a few helpful tricks while figuring out how to translate those other techniques for my machine, so I thought it would be fun to share my process for knitting a complete sock in case it helps anyone else trying to get started knitting with this model. The main feature of this design that sets it apart from a lot of other circular sock machines you'll see in crank-along tutorials is the layout of the cams. This model has a very simple V-shaped tension cam design that pulls the needles down twice, once before they pick up new yarn, and then again after picking up new yarn, which it pulls down and through the old loop, creating a new stitch. This symmetry allows the machine to knit in either direction without any fancy hardware, which is great. But that first pull down puts you at greater risk of dropping stitches if you follow some of the directions intended for more sophisticated spring-loaded mechanisms that allow the needles to stay high during that first section. The older models of the Dean and Bean sock machines looked like they had a similar dual V-cam layout, so their 1.0 instructions are a helpful place to look for tips. However, that model has been discontinued, so the available tutorials just aren't as diverse. Another feature that's common to see in other setups is a heel spring. That's a device for automatically tightening up the slack in the yarn at the beginning and end of rows when you're knitting heels and toes. There are some options out there that I might eventually add to my system, but in the meantime, I've had perfectly good results managing that slack by hand. It just takes a little bit of practice. In addition to the machine itself, I'm going to be using a few other tools, most of which I'll explain a bit more as I go. I've got my cast-on bonnet. I used the Dean and Bean tutorial to make mine. 2 pounds of soft exercise weights, which I have attached to a weight buckle. This model was designed by Jerry Baggett. 2 bundles of scrap yarn, a length of ravel cord, some little sewing clips, and a weighted clip. 2 different styles of bobby pins, which I like to use for stitch markers or stitch holders. 3 fork weights, each of which has a 5-ounce fishing weight attached. And a loom tool or a hook. And last but not least, we need some yarn. For today's sock, I'll be knitting with this Patton's Croix sock in meadow stripes. But first, I need to wind it onto a cone, because the machine only really likes to knit with a yarn that feeds super smoothly and loosely, and even a center pole ball has a little bit too much tension. It's possible but tedious to wind a cone by hand, or some people use an attachment on a handheld drill, but I decided to design my own fancy contraption for this process because, just look at this aesthetic cone. I'll actually be knitting the second sock to pair with this one here, which has a simple short row heel and toe and a folded hem cuff. It's a self-striping yarn, so I want to double check that I'm starting my second sock at the same place in the color repeat. I actually already matched up the yarns in advance before knitting sock number 1, but it's still good to double check that I'm working with the right end. I'm setting the machine up for success by installing my cast-on bonnet. This is a tube of knitting that has little metal split rings that get hung on every other needle, which gives the yarn something to knit into, and it's also a convenient place to hang my weights. I hang the first couple of rings right in front of the yarn feeder. I don't need to worry about aligning this with any of my cylinder marks yet, and I also like to temporarily hang a couple of rings halfway right across the cylinder to help distribute the weight at first. But they don't need to be placed exactly, I can always move them later. Speaking of weights, I'm using approximately 2 pounds here, which I have hooked onto this buckle. When I first started knitting on this machine, I was a bit afraid of the buckle, so I was using these as soft weights inside the cylinder. But I find I can get much more consistent tension when they hang freely below the machine, so the buckle was a really nice upgrade. Before knitting with my sock yarn, I'm going to get a bit warmed up and get a few rounds established with some scrap yarn. It's also sometimes known as waste yarn, but I've been using mine over and over again, so it doesn't really go to waste. My yarns will be feeding from the floor up and over the tension mast. I could fine-tune the tension by zigzagging the yarn around these pegs on the left, but with this particular sock yarn, I know that I don't need the additional drag, so I'm just going to go straight across and then down to my little wire spiral and through the yarn feeder. I add one of these little sewing clips to anchor the loose yarn end and tuck it all inside the cast-on bonnet. By the way, this little butterfly of scrap yarn is small and loose enough that it doesn't need to be wound onto a cone, but I would do that if it were a bigger ball. I've discovered that I like to start off my knitting in the round with my left hand tension cam loosened all the way to the top so that it doesn't pull my stitches too deep before they grab the new yarn. This helps make the knitting smoother, especially when there are multiple loops of yarn on one needle. The right-hand tension cam will be actively forming new stitches though, so I have that set to my working tension at all times. It took a little bit of trial and error to find the sweet spot, but this seems to be a comfortable tension for this yarn. Now I can start cranking slowly around clockwise, hanging split rings on every second needle as they move toward the yarn feeder. Once I have a bunch of rings hung, I can move these temporary weight-bearing ones to the correct spot and keep cranking around a couple of clicks at a time. After all the rings have been hung and I've got a round or two of stitches established, I go around and check to make sure every needle has a loop of yarn around it. I'm pulling up a ladder from inside the cylinder to hang on an empty needle if I find any. Once they're all full, I can crank freely for several rounds and get a good chunk of knitting going. When I have only a little bit of scrap yarn left, I stop cranking with the main red mark just past the yarn feeder by about 2 or 3 needles. I'm going to pull the tail of the scrap yarn through so it'll catch one needle anti-clockwise past the mark. Then I grab a length of ravel cord in a contrasting color. In this case, I'm choosing the red because it will be the easiest to tell apart from my green sock yarn. I thread this around the loop-de-loop and through the yarn feeder, and then I pull a moderate tail over the red mark so it overlaps the same needle that will have the final stitch of scrap yarn. Adding or changing yarns is a point where I've found it's really easy to accidentally drop stitches. Looking at this from the other angle, we can see that these yarns are both in good position to be caught by the latches, but sometimes they can fall underneath the latches and then they won't be knit correctly. It's a good thing to keep an eye on, and I'm cranking slowly as I start this section so that I can notice and correct anything that isn't quite catching correctly. When I've cranked all the way back around to the same point with the red mark just a few needles past the yarn feeder, I'll repeat the previous steps. Pull the tail of the ravel cord into the cylinder, over the needle past the mark, and then I add my project yarn so it overlaps that same needle. I don't need a very long tail on my project yarn since the folded hem doesn't require a lot of finishing. Something I'm doing here that I actually forgot to do on the previous yarn change is to twist all these tails together, and I'm going to hang a little weighted clip on them so they have a bit of tension and they don't try to escape. Before I start cranking with the project yarn, I set my row counter to 0, and then I crank about a round and a half, stopping with the red main mark on the left and the black halfway mark on the right. This next step is a totally optional personal preference thing, but to make life a little bit easier for future sparks, I like to add some stitch markers now, while it's still easy to see how they line up to the cylinder markings. I'm grabbing a long black bobby pin to mark the very first little bump formed on the first round, under the red mark. It'll be right next to the tail, between what looks like 2 rows of red ravel cord bumps. For the rest of the stitches I want to mark, I use these shorter brown bobby pins so it's easier to tell the first stitch apart. I like to mark the stitch on the anti-clockwise side of the cylinder markings, and then I also add a couple on either side of the first stitch. I do the half of the cylinder closest to me, and then I finish cranking around and do the same on the other side. Keep in mind that the last stitch in the round is going to sit a little bit higher than the first, since there's a bit of a jog in the spiral where they join. Now, like I said, this step is totally optional, and now that I'm comfortable hanging the hem, sometimes I forget to do it, and it's totally fine. But it's always nice to have options to make life a little less stressful, you know? Once all those markers have been placed, I can just crank and crank and crank for a while. I'm aiming for 30 rounds, but the row counter started counting from 0, and only increments at the very end of each round. If you're a programmer, this might sound a bit familiar. I want to pause and make sure I'm set up for the next step before the main mark gets all the way around to trigger the next row counter. So I'm going to slow down when the row counter reads 29, stopping with my main red mark on the left and the halfway black mark on the right. At this stage, I'm taking my weights off temporarily by removing the buckle, and I'll also get rid of that weighted clip from my yarn tails since they're no longer in danger of coming loose. I'm carefully reaching inside the cylinder to find that black bobby pin stitch marker I placed earlier, and gently pulling it up to place it on the needle next to the red main mark, anti-clockwise side. I do the same with the rest of the marked stitches on this half of the cylinder, and then I grab my pointy loom tool to pick up and hang the unmarked stitches in between. I'm looking for the green bumps in between my 2 stripes of ravel cord, just like when I was placing the bobby pins. I know it's all gone according to plan if I have the exact number of bumps to fill up the empty needles. After hanging all of the hem stitches I can reach on this half of the round, I need to re-hang my weight in order to crank over to the other side. To get the buckle to grip correctly, the bonnet needs to be fed into the buckle from the underside, which I found a little bit counterintuitive at first. I flip the buckle over, open the jaws, and feed the bonnet through, and then when I let go, the weight flips it over and closes the jaws on the fold of fabric. Even with the weight reattached, the distribution is going to be a little bit lopsided since half of the hem is already lifted up. So to help things along, I'm also sticking my fingers in there to help push down the knitting in the working area where the new stitches are forming. At this point, I hear and feel something unusual, and it looks like a needle got slightly twisted and jammed as it was passing the cams. I'm able to jiggle it around and get it unblocked, but it's too far past for that stitch to knit correctly, so I'll have to come back and manually fix it later. For now, I'm just going to pull that needle up and out of work until I can handle it. With the other half of the cylinder in front of me now, I'm repeating the same steps, removing the weight, hanging my marked stitches, and then filling in the rest of the bumps on the needles in between. If I happen to accidentally pull any needles or stitches out of place, I just make sure to check that the latches are still tucked in so I won't drop the stitch. Alright, I'm still going to need to deal with this bad boy, but first I'm going to set up for the next section so that I can crank this treble needle into a spot where it's easier to reach. I reattach my weight buckle and reset my row counter to 0, and then I crank just a little bit so the raised needle is in front of me. It looks like this pink loop on top should be the new stitch, so I'm going to place that into the hook so the latch closes over it, and then lift the other 2 loops over the hook and off the needle. Now I can finally start cranking again, slowly at first, and wait, oh no, what? It's a knot. Good thing I was paying attention. I'll have to cut that out so it doesn't jam up anywhere. I decided to use this loopy technique to rejoin my yarns, which I've heard referred to as a faux Russian join, but I could have instead added the new yarn the same way I switched between my ravel cord and the other yarns earlier. The advantage of this technique is that I don't have to weave in the ends later, because they get knit right into the stitches as I go. I double the first yarn back on itself to make a loop, and make sure the cut end is caught in a couple of stitches. Then I thread the new yarn end through the little loop and double it back on itself as well, so I have 2 loops clasped around each other. I crank slowly until I'm sure both strands of the joined yarn are securely knitting in, finally pick up some speed to crank the rest of the sock leg. For my personal measurements with this yarn, I'm going to need 55 total rows, so I'm once again stopping when my counter reads one less than my total, with the red mark on my left and the black mark on my right. And now it's an excellent time to take a little break and collect my calm before setting up to knit the heel section. Okay, we're back and refreshed and ready to take on a challenge. I've got my fork weights handy, and I'll start by raising all of the needles on the first half of the cylinder between my red and black marks. This puts them out of the cam track so they won't be knit. This is also a great opportunity to adjust my weight buckle because it's low enough that it might start bumping into things which would interfere with my tension. I'm just opening up the jaws and sliding more of the cast-on bonnet through so that it dangles freely again. I need to finish cranking the other half of the cylinder and then I'm about to start in on my heel, but I actually forgot a really crucial step. You see, the heel gets knit back and forth, so I stop, raise the last needle that I just finished knitting, and then start to crank in the other direction. But do you remember how I talked about loosening the left-hand cam when I don't need it? Well, now I'm knitting in both directions, and I do, in fact, need it. But this is the moment I realize I didn't remember to reset the tension, so none of these stitches are going to knit. At this point, it's easier to just crank through the mistake and fix it once those needles are back around on my side of the machine. And here's the culprit. I've got to lower it to match the tension on the other side before I can keep going. All of these stitches are now sitting underneath the latches, and if I don't fix that now, then the next time those needles pass under the first cam, the stitches will drop right off before they have the chance to pick up new yarn. To prevent this, I have to go through and manually retuck the latches back into each of those stitches that didn't knit correctly on that last failed pass. This is one of the major downsides of this style of cams on this machine. Alright, all fixed, tension is set, yarn is rethreaded, first needle is lifted, stars are aligned, let's rock and roll. Remember that I lifted a needle out of work at the end of the last row? That was the last needle worked, so it has the yarn attached to it. And as we approach the yarn feeder, we should see that the yarn is wrapping around that raised needle before knitting the first stitch of the next row. That wrap is important to prevent holes. Because I don't have a heel spring on my setup, I have to take up the extra slack in the yarn by hand. I hold it firmly just until the first needles catch, and then let it flow once I can feel the yarn gaining tension. I finish cranking that row and once again raise the last needle that I just knit, and I'm giving the yarn a slight gentle tug so the stitch snugs up around the leg of the needle to hold it up in place. Now it's time to add my heel weights. They go up between the cylinder and the sock fabric, with one about in the center of the two yellow marks, and the other two at either side of the working section, right below the outermost active needles. We need those extra weights since the fabric will only get more and more lopsided from here, and the heel stitches won't get much benefit from the big buckle weights as we start to form a three-dimensional pouch. So I'll have to keep readjusting their position as I put more needles out of work. So I think I could probably get one more pass before I have to move these in. Even with these weights, sometimes the endmost stitches need a little bit of help knitting off. So I crank slowly to keep an eye on things, and sometimes I'll stick my fingers in to give them a bit of extra tension or to help push the loop over the back of the hook as it comes past. Occasionally, even that doesn't do the trick. This stitch didn't knit, so I need to manually lift the old stitch over the new loop before I continue. I carry on like this, raising the needle attached to the working yarn at the start of each row, managing the slack in the yarn, adjusting my weights, fixing missed stitches, until I get to my yellow heel markings. I lift the last needle to the outside of the yellow marking on the right, I crank across, and lift the last needle on the left. Now I need to prepare for short rowing back out again, adding needles back into work. I'm going to be doing a 1 up, 2 down method, and this will count as my 1 up for this row. I like to put my held needles back into work right in front of the yarn feeder, where there's a little gap between the cams to push them down into knitting position just in time to catch the yarn. These are my 2 down needles. I continue adjusting my heel forks pretty frequently as I start this section of the heel, but as it gets wider, I find I don't need to move them quite as often as I did when short rowing in. I carry on knitting back and forth, lifting one needle up on the side with the yarn, snugging up that stitch, pulling up the slack as I knit across, and pushing 2 needles down right in front of the yarn feeder. Now I've got almost all of the needles between the red and black marks back into work, and I need to start paying attention again soon. When I'm putting the raised needles back into work, I need to keep an eye on the latches to make sure they're fully open, otherwise they can get caught against the yarn feeder and get jammed. I really take my time here, and I don't try to speed through this section since it always just costs me more time to correct mistakes than to go slowly in the first place. I've raised my last needle on the right, and I'm about to lower these last 2 needles on the left. I'll raise one of these needles again on the left pass, and then we're going to start cranking in the round again. So I'll be putting all these needles back into work. I crank slowly, 1 click at a time, pushing each of these needles down at the break between the cams. At this point, I can also loosen my tension on the left again. When all the needles have been lowered, I'm going to reset my row counter and stop with the red mark on the left. To close up any gaps at the corner of the heel, I'm lifting a stitch from the instep half onto the first heel needle on either side. This seems to help keep things connected. I'm going to keep my fork weights attached for a while, but I do reposition them. Then I can crank freely for the rest of the foot, which in my case is 45 rounds. I knit the toe almost exactly the same way as the heel, except this time I'm going to remember to set my tension before I start. I wanted to mention an alternative for putting the 2 down needles back into work. If if you don't love having to catch them in that tiny gap in front of the yarn feeder, you can push them down before you start knitting the row. The reason I don't prefer this is because you have to tuck the latch back in to avoid dropping the stitch, and I find it very fiddly to get a hold of both of these loops when the needle has that wrap on it. If I wait to push them down at the last minute, I just don't have to fuss with this step. Here, one of the needles closed its latch without catching yarn in the hook, but I spotted it in time to fix it. So like I said, I knit the toe just like the heel right up until the last row. I think maybe there are slightly different techniques that create a more elegant finish, but so far this is the only way I've been able to actually remember what I'm doing, so it's good enough for me for now. Anyway, we're nearly done. So I make sure I've got some contrasting scrap yarn handy. I lift this last one-up needle on the left and I knit across like usual. And I start pushing needles down like usual, but I'm going to stop and switch to scrap yarn when my red mark is just a little bit past the yarn feeder. This looks quite similar to what we did in the beginning, but this time I am not going to double up the two yarns on one needle. My sock yarn is going to finish on the final heel needle, and my scrap yarn is going to start on the next needle. And it's a really, really good idea to clip those yarn ends together right now. Also super important, again, to look closely to make sure both of those yarns are getting caught in their respective hooks by their latches. I pop all the rest of these needles down, still keeping an eye out for any signs of trouble, but once that first round of scrap yarn is knitting in, we're pretty much good to go. One last little thing I like to do to make things easier for myself is to add a little bobby pin marker to that last heel stitch by the black mark. This needle was the only one left that still had a wrap on it, and I've noticed that it's quite easy to miss when I go to graft the toe closed later. So I take an opportunity now to put a pin through when I can still clearly see both the stitch and the wrap. This is entirely optional though. Crankety crank 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 until I have several rounds to secure my work and I can see the tail of the scrap yarn. And then I remove the fork weights. I'm not going to remove the big weight yet, but I will hang on to it as I crank off so that it doesn't thud to the floor. I gotta say, I am super excited to see that all my stripes lined up and I have what should be a perfectly matched pair of socks. I almost forgot to show you one of my favorite parts of the process, which is removing the ravel cord. This just makes it super easy to get the finished sock apart from the scrap yarn. I pull out the ends and then I flip it over and grab a loop from about halfway around. I just tug on that and keep pulling and pulling till it all magically comes apart. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful, or at least entertaining. You can catch up with me next time when I continue telling you about my own design for a knitting machine. Keep an eye out for that in the next couple of weeks, and until next time, stay curious.